Hey, welcome to DC Signal to Noise. Our last one, Jim, before we hit the election on Tuesday.
It's a E-Day, election night coming up. We'll see if we have winners or losers for
Yeah.
sure.
So we'll get into recording the show here in just a minute. For those who have tuned in before, you know how this works. We'll chat for a little bit beforehand and then actually start recording. But this is also a good time if you're watching on Facebook. Drop a comment in there and let us know what you'd like us to talk about today, because we largely just wing it, don't we, Jim? We know what we're going to talk about. We think a little bit about what we're going to talk about. But
generalities, yeah.
You know what the show is going to be, or we know what the show is going to be when you know what the show is going to be. It all happens here live. That's what we like about it. Especially, we do really like getting the comments on Facebook there, so we can react to them in real time. So
yes,
let us know what you want us to talk about. If you got a reaction to what we're talking about, drop it in there, so we can discuss it.
And in particular, certain races, either in the House or the Senate, that you may want us to help monitor on election night and following.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Or we know there's Prop 15 out in California that we're going to be watching. Are there any other propositions or local issues that you think are of interest to agriculture? Let us know that we should be watching on election night. With that, Jim, you saw the list I sent out. We're going to talk a little bit about the death of COVID aid before the election. The screwy World Board and China numbers. This is getting more and more perplexing by the day. Farm Journal polls on the election and kind of the home stretch of the election here. Of course, we'll spend some time talking about that. You had an interesting piece this week, Jim, about kind of the pluses and minuses for agriculture for whichever way the election goes. And I want to get into that. So
Sure.
That was an interesting piece. And then we got things like Commodity Classic announced today that they're going to go virtual. We'll talk about that a little bit and whatever else comes up in the comments. So anything to add to that list, Jim?
No, but we may want to set up a thing where any listeners or viewer, if they want to read that special report, I can send you the updated copy, John, and we can send it out, because I did put some work into that.
Yeah, so we'll do that as a special bonus. Anybody tuning in right now, send us an email, and we'll mention this again at the end of the show, but send us an email at signaltonoise@farmjournal.com, and we'll send it back out to you. How's that sound, Jim?
Yes, fantastic.
All right. With that, why don't we go ahead and record a podcast?
Absolutely.
Here we go. In 3, 2, 1. It's Friday. That means it's DC Signal to Noise, and the last DC Signal to Noise before election night. Jim Wiesmeyer, Pro Farmer, thanks for joining me again today. I'm John Harris from Farm Journal, and a long list to get through today, Jim, including our last-minute election thoughts, some polls polling information on the election as we head into the home stretch, what the election could mean for agriculture no matter which way it goes. Commodity Classic announced today they're canceling. A whole bunch of news things to cover on this week's DC Signal to Noise, Jim.
Yes. Yeah. You know, that is a big list, but why don't we start with the Pulse poll?
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, let's start there. It surprises me that it doesn't surprise me that 85% of those who responded to our Pulse poll, about 1,300 respondents, 85% said that they plan to vote for Donald Trump, 11% for Joe Biden, 4% undecided. What surprises me is that number really has not changed since in the months that we've been doing that poll. I would have thought things would have tightened a little bit, especially reflecting what we've seen in some of the national polling. Yes. But now it's virtually unchanged since the day we first ran that poll.
Now, is it just a single question, John, that you send out?
Yes, it is. Okay. It is just a single question. So there's no crosstabs on that, and no digging deeper into reasons. But I think, you and I, and we've talked to Chip Flory about this too, about what we're hearing from farmers and ranchers about why they feel so strongly on that. And I think Chip said it best. There's a big separation among farm and ranch voters between policy and personality, and they're looking at the policy side of this.
Yes, and a number of farmers and ranchers have told me they've never experienced a president that talks to and about agriculture as much as President Trump. And I'll back that up in my reporting, and I've done it almost 50 years. I mean, right or wrong, whether or not you like him or are vociferously against him, he has spoken about agriculture a lot.
Has spoken about agriculture a lot, has shown up at agricultural events a lot, and let's be blunt, has spent a lot of federal tax dollars, our tax dollars, in farm and ranch country.
Very much so.
$28 billion. Yeah.
Yes, very much so. So, yeah, I was surprised. I thought we might see a few percentage points, down on Trump because of what you said. And, the Democrats really want to cut into that margin. They don't, to declare victory in rural country or progress, they want to get a 2 to 3 percentage point, penetration into that historical margin. And we'll see, I think, a few days. I think it's going to take a few days after the election to see whether or not they're successful. And if not, then they'll have to look at their policies again.
Yeah, and I think Chip was right on the nose about why we haven't seen that number for Trump soften at all. And I think that's attributable to the Chinese ag purchases that we've seen in recent weeks and months, and improving commodity prices. I think that has what kept the number at 85%, rather than maybe softening a little bit in the waning days of the campaign.
And even expanding other commodities. I know, rice growers who I talk to a lot, we finally saw some U.S. rice sales, and actually the first shipment, got out recently. So yeah, that'll get your mood up.
All right. So what are we watching in these last days? I know you've got your eye on Biden in Iowa today. That's his first trip to Iowa since he won the nomination.
Yes, I want to see and hear what he says about his energy policy, because he is a supporter of electronic vehicles, and he's proposed 50,000 charging stations, EV charging stations. Nothing wrong with that, John, but that's some timidity on the part of corn-based ethanol, producers, where they see his long-term energy plan is to really get into the EVs and other energy sectors relative to climate change, et cetera, which could be some good stuff for agriculture coming down the pike relative to not just carbon credits, but other aspects. But that's what I know farmers are going to be listening for, and the ethanol industry.
Yeah, and you and I have talked about this before, including on AgriTalk this morning. But there is opportunity for corn growers in this. I mean, we talked about this last week. It's inevitable that we're going to see a move to a move away from internal combustion engines. That is going to march on and march on and march on. The timetable of it is somewhat what is in question, but also there needs to be a transition to help benefit the environment before we get to that point. And that's where ethanol could really play a role. If we could boost ethanol content to boost octane and to reduce carbon emissions, I think that could be a real win for the Biden administration, saying, hey, we're not going to wait for EVs to be here. We're going to take action on the environment with ethanol now, and not only improve octane, but push automakers to use engines that can capitalize on that improved octane and the higher compression that's available with that in order to make more efficient vehicles.
Yes, and some of that could come into the rewriting, if you will, of the RFS as we reset it, so to speak, because the authorization for the Renewable Fuel Standard Program expires in 2022. That means next calendar year, 2021, we're going to have the debate start in earnest. So now's the time to get proposals down on paper, and it will also be important, whoever wins, Trump or Biden, their administration, who's at the head of EPA, because that'll help direct where the executive branch is going relative to the reauthorization of the, if so, of the RFS, and of course, who controls Congress will be paramount on that topic.
Well, you've also said and written that there's a possibility of there being say, energy and environment czar within the White House that could be key to watch.
Yeah, that's what my Biden people are signaling. They don't know whether he or she will be called an energy czar, something similar to that. And if that's the case, then you have to look at their portfolio and where they come in relationship to the EPA administrator. Personnel is always important in a cabinet. I think even more so it will be relative to any Biden administration, because as we saw, Trump was so hands-on that if he didn't like a particular cabinet either leader or their policy, he just directed it himself, and almost across the board. I've not seen that in any administration I've covered. So, but personnel is policy, and especially as if we get a change in the White House.
All right, we'll come back to the presidential election in just a moment. But while we're on elections, we got a comment here from Margot wanting an explanation of Prop 15 out in California.
You have to say that. I haven't boned up on it, but I will.
Well, and I haven't either, other than it's a change in tax policy that could be a tool to do away with some limits on property taxes on rural land in California. I would encourage you to go back and look at the AgriTalk schedule for this week. They had some folks that are much more knowledgeable than us about Prop 15 that talked about it. You can go back and look at go to agritalk.com and look back on either Tuesday or Wednesday, I think it was, and you can get a full explanation of Prop 15 there.
But rest assured, we'll have that down pat on election night, and then we'll monitor it as well. We'll have a brief summary, and then we'll track it as the night and the morning goes on, as far as where that proposition is going.
And then Logan, checking in with a long commentary here, says Hillary was guaranteed to win, or they said Hillary was guaranteed to win until 9 p.m. on election night. Polls are worthless, which is why a lot of people are hedging their bets in 2020 on any projections. Biden hasn't done anything in 47 years other than got rich off his last name and political positions. Joe Biden is everything that's wrong with this country. He will destroy the meat industry with the Green New Deal. He will destroy the oil industry and taxes into bankruptcy. Biden is absolutely last thing agriculture needs or this country needs.
Well, let's take
again,
that.
Those are comments from Logan,
Okay.
not us. But
well, some of what she says, I think, is true, especially on pollsters. We know.
Yeah.
They're trying to revisit 2016, saying, well, they weren't too far off. I'm sorry. I'm a Catholic and you can go to confession, but that's not right. They did a bad job, a horrible job in 2016. And the wide consensus amongst the pollsters and pundits are that Biden's going to win, and they're probably going to be a trifecta where the Democrats will retain control of the House and regain control of the Senate. I just say, boy, the Senate's going to be so close. I don't know who could call it with great, cockiness, assuredness. The House, I do see a consensus that the Democrats are going to add to their number of seats. As far as what a Biden administration would mean for policy, he's going to have to get his plans through whatever Congress that we have. And that brings us to the Senate. If Biden were to win, who controls the Senate is going to be very important for either if Trump, wins again, or if Biden. The reason is that their policies have to be approved, and even if the Democrats were to regain the Senate, by what margin? Margin's going to be very important in the Senate, especially for Biden. We know that a 50-50 vote, the vice president breaks ties, but even with a 51-49. Or a 52-48, Biden may still have trouble because there's going to be a couple of moderate Democrats in the Senate that may not like some of the, proposals coming out from the more left wing of the Democratic Party. So, that margin's going to be very important to watch on election night. As far as his other policies, the Democrats on average uh, usually gear their policy towards smaller and medium-sized producers. That's just what history shows. They tend to look at the payment limitations, payment caps. They usually like to lower them, or at least make efforts to lower them. But there's a 100% indication that I will tell you there'll be more nutrition and food safety oriented, because that's what the past has shown. The unknowns are in that climate change arena of how soon would they propose things, and what would be the impacts, but it's going to have to be approved by Congress as well. And it may not be as easy as they think.
Yeah, Jim, the more I've talked to you over the past few weeks, the more and more I'm starting to hope for a relatively evenly split Senate, just because it brings about that moderation that you talk about. It doesn't allow one side or the other to push through any idea that they have to find some way to moderate to win those votes.
Yes. I've always, as a reporter and analyst, I've always liked, checks and balances. And I think the majority of Americans do as well. And we're going to see on election night where the consensus amongst those pollsters say that we'll continue to see less split ticketing that we've seen in the last few years. That's been a trend. I'm not quite so sure this election, because of that nature, John, that if they vote, say, for Biden for president in a state, they may want to choose, if there's a Republican and Democratic Senate race up in their state, they may want to choose the opposite party just for that reason. And that could become important in states like Iowa, Arizona, and it could lead to, some surprises on election night.
Interesting. Well, we'll be watching for surprise. Listen, I know Chip asked us this morning on AgriTalk about predictions for election night. He didn't ask me because I told him before I wasn't going to give a prediction. And the reason I don't is because I really enjoy watching election night unfold without any preconceived notions about what it's going to be, and just seeing what the story is that the election map is telling us that night. It's to me, it's more than just winners and losers. It's how did they lay out their win across the country?
I agree with that. That we like to watch the trends even on election night. We'll have certain counties that we're watching in Florida and Pennsylvania, the key states. We'll look at demographic groups, senior citizen votes. Is there a decline in the percentage for President Trump? We'll see that. We'll see whether or not that's the case in Sumter County, Florida, early election night. I think we'll know that by 7:30 Eastern time already.
Really?
Yes, and other trends, the Hispanic vote can vary by the state you're in, because Florida Hispanic, you have your Cuban American voters, are different. So we're going to look at those particular trends and eventually the rural vote, but that's going to take some more time. I like to point out now, especially since I've gone back to Twitter, which I don't like to begin with, but
we're dragging you there for election night.
Yes,
which we'll talk about in a little bit.
I've seen the sensitivity of if you say anything on elections, but we don't endorse anyone. I never have and never will as a writer, analyst, and a reporter definitely shouldn't. But politics is indeed important in the business of agriculture for policy. And I don't think I have to convince many farmers and ranchers of that. But you would be surprised at the number of people who don't think we should ever talk about politics on an ag-related program. I just disagree with that.
Or what both frustrates and amuses me is, as analysts, if we say that something that Trump did was a beneficial move for him, all of a sudden it's, you're just promoting Trump. Or we'll get the same thing if we say something was positive or negative for Biden. Yes. We'll get the same kind of reaction. It's like, no, we're not saying that. We're just saying that this particular instance or this particular move, this maneuver was something that was either beneficial or not beneficial to their campaign. That's all we're saying.
Yeah, we can take it. We've heard it
Oh,
before,
yeah.
but I think the vast majority of people know that we're trying to do our job, and there's our pluses and minuses with each candidate, whether he or she be at the presidential level, the representative level, or the Senate level. And, that's what elections are all about. We try to connect dots as far as where things may go relative to the policy in the agribusiness sector.
All right, before we move off the presidential election, any final comments or predictions for election night?
Well, I think it's very important to see where both Trump and Biden are campaigning in the last few days. It's the Midwest states, and I think that's major. It tells me that both candidates know those states are very close and could go either way, and I include Minnesota in that. Trump's backup plan is he really has to win one of those, Great Lakes states. And if he doesn't, it's the path to victory is going to be very hard for him. Not impossible, but hard. And his backup plan, if that were to happen, would be to get Nevada, still a wild card for him to get Nevada and New Hampshire, but not impossible. Biden is campaigning today in Des Moines, Iowa, which tells me you don't campaign in the last few days in a state in which you're comfortable in. So he's not comfortable in Iowa. And I note that some name pollsters are saying Texas is in play for the presidential race. I just don't see that. And you don't see Biden going down to Texas the last few days. I think that's volume.
Yeah, but you do see him going to Georgia and Florida. What does that say?
Well, Georgia, there's 2 Senate races up that we may not know the result until January the 5th, because if either race doesn't get more than 50%, it's in a runoff race on January the 5th. We're going to have one for sure that'll be punted to January the 5th, Loeffler's race.
And it looked 6 candidates or something in that one.
Yeah, 21 candidates.
Or 21. Oh wow,
21, I think. Yeah, and David Perdue, the ag secretary's cousin, is in a very close race with Ossoff. So that if they don't get 50% or more, that's going to head to January the 5th. So if we're close in the Senate, again, we won't be able to even call it. But I do think runoff elections tend to favor, especially in Georgia, it would tend to favor the Republicans in that case, because history, again, I only go back to history. History shows that certain demographic groups don't vote in runoff elections, and that usually benefits Republicans. So those are the nuances that we're looking at, John. A number of people have emailed me asking, what about the impact of all this early voting? And I'm good friends with David Wasserman of the Cook Political Report, and he's a number cruncher, and I trust him. I really do. And he says, he tells me, don't read too much of anything into the early voting, because it doesn't suggest that much, because you don't know the full breakdowns of it. And also, we've had new voters come in, like in Texas. They've added, since 2016 election, Texas have added 1.8 million more voters. So even though they're exceeding what they all voted for, what, John, in 2018?
2016.
They have 1.8 million more voters. So, I wouldn't, count too much on this early voting. Plus, history also shows that Republicans like to go to the polls on average. So that's why we can't read too much into the early voting.
No, I think the one thing the early voting does help us on election night, though, is if Joe Biden is doing well early in the election night tabs, that is probably, again, a good sign for him and for an early decision on the vote. If Donald Trump is more neck and neck or even leading Joe Biden, then it's probably a good sign for Donald Trump, or at least a sign that it's going to go long getting the results in.
Yeah, it could be. The number crunchers are going to be there looking at all those things. How a county usually votes, what percentage is it, and if it tilts to a certain percentage, that's when the pundits get more confidence of the to call a particular county. I mentioned David Wasserman. He's a consultant to NBC News on election night, and he's behind the cameras, and he's one of, I don't know what he said, 15 people that they have at NBC News analyzing, number crunching, cussing and discussing what they're seeing and things like that. So there's a lot of muscle that goes into election night analysis, and that's just NBC. Fox and CBS does the same thing.
Well, and the major networks, a lot of the major news outlets have also formed a consortium this year. I know Reuters, which we subscribe to, is part of that, that they are going to work collaboratively on at least declaring winners on election night. So there will be some sort of consensus brought among some of those news outlets before any winners are declared on election night. And I think it's another sensitivity to 2016.
Yes, I think that collaboration is long overdue. I think it's needed because you don't want to, pull an approval either one too early, because it could stem some voting if it's even before election booths close, and two, you just don't want to have an error of what we saw in previous years. Gore,
2000,
and Bush.
2000 would probably be the biggest,
Absolutely.
example of that, when we saw some declaring Florida for Gore initially, and the other networks were scrambling to catch up and went ahead and declared as well, just because they didn't want to be left behind.
Yes.
And then the same thing happened when it flipped to Bush.
Yes.
In Florida.
With Florida's electoral votes and the way they have improved their counting, but believe it or not, I think we're going to get some results pretty quickly in Florida. But here's what analysts look for. For Biden, they'll look at Miami-Dade County and to see where Biden, that's a Democratic bastion, and they'll look at Biden, the votes for Biden, to see how they are relative to history. And this is what analysts do. And if he's above, then I think they'll feel more comfortable that pattern will play out in some other Democratic leaning counties. And if not, then that'll be the first barometer that Biden is not as powerful as some of these, a lot of the polls, tend to indicate, John.
Yep, indeed. Wendy checking in says Trump supporters waiting for the real election day. I don't personally agree with that. I personally like being able to vote early here in Indiana and going and getting to choose what day I go down there to do it and wait 3.5 hours to cast my ballot.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything wrong. I just wish security would be enough where we could vote online and then not even have to go. And I do think this will help on election day. I just happen to vote on election day because it's history with me and my parents. We would always walk up to the voting booth, so I still like to do that. But it lessens, or should, in many cases, not all, should lessen the crowds on election day, and I think that's good. As well. So as long as you have an opportunity to vote. I do, however, think that here's where we can connect dots here. The presidential debates all should occur before the first state allows early voting. I think that should be a change in the next time we have presidential debates, to at least have them in a process in which the states can't go out and vote before we actually have the debate. So, maybe we'll get some reform in that area next time, John.
I would not argue against that at all. Interesting question, I think, that we'll like discussing here from Margot. Jim says, growing up in a rural farming Central California, our rural area was always Democrat, but fiscally conservative or moderate Democrats. Has the farming political philosophy changed? In your opinion, has this changed? Well, we certainly don't see those so-called blue dog Democrats anymore. I think Colin Peterson, from my perspective, is the only one that's left where you see a real fiscal conservative Democrat in there. But you used to see quite a number of them. Charlie Stenholm down in Texas. I'm going to struggle to come up with the rest of the names, but probably about 4 cycles ago, there were quite a few that left politics.
Yeah, because both political parties, where even conservatives in the Republican Party got where they had to move further right because the fear of being primaried by their own party. Right. Same thing on the liberal side. It's a good question relative to. I don't think the overarching reason the majority of rural voters, not just farmers and ranchers, rural, vote Republican 62% usually, what I remember. It's not just, of course, it's not just agriculture policy, it's social policy, gun policy, things like that. I don't think that has changed. What I would be interested to ask Margot is in the last few years, we've seen more than a few Californians move to Arizona, Colorado, Texas. I've been researching the demographics of, are those more liberals moving down, or are those conservative rural people in California? I don't know whether you'll know, Margot, but I think that overall is changing the dynamics of a few states. We're already seeing it in Arizona that has turned purple. Yeah. Texas is showing hints of turning purple. We'll know more after this election. But you also see it down from New England when they retire and go to the Florida area. They bring their attitudes that they've been through in their individual states. Other people tell me, well, if they don't like the way the state is run, such as say California, why would they want to vote when they go to another state for a more liberal candidate if that's why they're leaving? Fair point.
Fair point, but I think you hit on, especially on the congressional districts, you hit the nail on the head at the start of your comments there, and we've talked about again this before. But when we allow politicians to draw their own districts, you are not going to have anybody that approaches the center be elected into office anymore. And we've seen that play out again over the last 15 years, that they've just pushed further and further to the margins. And you're not seeing any Republicans that may have some more leftward leanings, or Democrats who lean a little more right fiscally. And personally, I think that has greatly hurt our Congress.
Yes, and that's why we're coming up in the census, and we have governor and state races, and they're going to be very important to watch, as well as the states, realign their districts, and we're going to see a few states lose representatives, a few states gain. All that's going to come about in the next few years. So this election is important, not just for the White House, House, and Senate, but in the state races for governors, control of state legislatures, because I say in my speeches, just as important as Washington is your state legislatures. Look at Nebraska, where the big cities there, the few big cities can control tax and land policy. So again, in the environmental end, those states wield a lot of power.
Well, in a lot of states, you're also voting for who's going to control those districting maps when the census is done.
Absolutely.
Yep. All right, let's move on, Jim. Let's talk about coronavirus aid. I think we found out this week. It was fairly clear earlier on, but it's without a doubt now. We know nobody really wanted a deal to be done before the election.
No, because the only way the House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Democrat, California, would have wanted it is if she got her $2.2 trillion, including all those billions.
But do you think she really even wanted? Do you think she even wanted that?
Yeah, I think not to want it. I think if she would have got it, then she would have declared absolute victory, because it's those funds that were not related whatsoever to COVID, the top end spending for New York City, California cities, Chicago, etc., that the Republicans in the White House just did not want. The White House wanted some liability protection, and the Democrats wanted no part of that. But generally, one can say now that going into the election, she didn't want, that, vote to occur. On the Republican side, the only consistent lawmaker on this has been Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader. He knows his membership, and he knew that it was even hard for him to convince them to clear a $500 billion aid package rather than from 1.8 trillion to 2.2 trillion dollars, and I know there was a disconnect between the White House and Mitch McConnell, because you heard President Trump saying, well, he'll be able to convince enough senators. He would not have been able to, because there were 15 to 20 Republican, senators who just did not want to go. They didn't even want to go to 500 billion, let alone above that. So that tells me, John, let's just assume assumptions here that the Democrats win it all on election night or thereafter, the White House, House, and Senate. What does that mean for the odds of an aid bill in the lame duck session of Congress? I cannot imagine the Senate, led until next year by Mitch McConnell, wanting to go with any major aid program. And Pelosi will say, well, they'll have all levers of the party come the next Congress, so we may have to wait. I could be wrong on that, where the Democrats may accept a far lower amount of aid package, and then they will say, we'll have part two once we're in full control. So watch that on election night as well. Those are the implications of what these election results, can mean.
But what if Trump wins re-election? Will Mitch McConnell and the Senate Republicans go along with some form? Will they be more inclined to go along with some form of coronavirus relief package?
That I would have to ask some of his people. I've not asked that one. But I just think you've got a change in attitude in the Senate all of a sudden on the growing deficit and the debt. You can just see it. So I don't know whether he would still be as amenable to unless the numbers showed that it was needed, John. I think McConnell, again, as I said before, is the most consistent person I've seen on this topic. I just won't rule it in. I just won't rule in a big amount.
Yeah, and also unless they get home, finish out their campaigning, and get an earful about it back home, which who knows if they will or won't on that.
Yeah, well, we've seen elections have consequences. So each lawmaker, either a new lawmaker coming in or existing one, will read those results and they'll vote accordingly.
All right, let's move on to the World Board. This is just a head scratcher, Jim. We've talked about it for the past couple of weeks, and that is the World Board has Chinese corn imports set at 7 million metric tons. We've already got commitments of over 12 million metric tons. And everybody's been saying, how can they sit on this number and stay committed to it? And the chairman of the World Board this week muddied the waters even further, saying that, well, essentially saying commitments aren't actual purchases. What do we make? Well, first of all, Jim, the question I want to ask is, because I know you said this morning that it didn't make sense, but is it that it doesn't make sense, or are they trying to throw a signal?
I'm just confused on the World Board. Now, it's the relatively new chairman, I think since March, is Mark Jackowski. He's a friend of mine. I used to work with him at Informa, so he's a man of integrity, smart guy, etc. That notwithstanding, I've covered the World Board, watched it since its start in 1977. That's when it was year one for the World Board. And I'm scratching my head, as well as contacts that I've had in the grain trade who really know their stuff, merchandisers. For over 30 years, my contacts, they're all saying, what's going on at the World Board? Now, to be fair, Mark said during a NASS meeting, which this question came up, the statistical service for USDA, he said export sales get canceled at times and that the World Board tries not to forecast foreign policy changes. Now that's relative to China has a low tariff TRQ for corn of 7.2 million tons. So that's why I guess they held with that 7 million tons. But then I went back to 2018 and 2019 marketing year, and USDA's forecast early on in that marketing year was below 7.2 million ton quota. It was the same quota during that year. So did USDA's World Board forecast foreign policy then? So it's inconsistent to me. On the fundamental side, we have proof that China's already bought 4 million tons at least of corn from Ukraine. So you add that up, and I don't think those sales are going to be canceled, plus the over 10 million tons from the U.S., not all shipped yet. I just think logic is escaping them. And it does impact, John, the carryover. USDA's total corn exports for 2021 marketing year is a little over 2.3 billion bushels. I've got serious analysts in the grain trade at 2.7 billion bushels. That's market sensitive. So I just think World Board is treading a line here to where they're not being transparent when they should be, and it could be market sensitive eventually when they do increase that number. And when they do, what information will they have at the time? They better hope that China issues a word, publicly. Because right now I think China's playing the World Board, and that's not a good situation. And the negative side on this is that stubbornly sticking with this China corn import figure may, and I emphasize may, cause data users to question the validity of the World Board's other forecast, and you never want to see that.
No. Well, and Tyne Morgan from U.S. Farm Report talked to Seth Meyer over at FAPRI about those numbers, and his response was that the World Board is essentially going to be forced into doing some sort of adjustment for November.
Well, let's break some news here. You always like when I break news on Signal to Noise.
We need a little sounder or something.
Yeah. We reported, I think first, earlier this week, Monday, that Rob Johansson, the top economist on the World Board, is going to depart to go to being an economist, I'll just say for a sugar group, to say it that way. One of the potential candidates is Seth Meyer. I'm not saying he's going to get it, but he's one of the potential candidates, John.
Yeah, in fact, I heard he's pretty high up on that list.
Well, he's very good. Sonny Perdue likes him. So I don't know, but that's interesting because Seth is a good guy. He knows FAPRI. So, he works at FAPRI, so he knows the fundamentals, and he used to be the prior World Board chairman. So he knows the inside, skinny of this stuff. So I think that's very interesting.
And Seth, if you're listening, a little bit of free advice: wait till after next week to decide on the job.
Well, you should see the emails I got, and I know Seth knows this. The top economist job on paper is not a political appointee. Yeah. On paper, right. It's not a political appointee. But I personally think an ag secretary wants his own top economist. So if it would be a turnover in the administration, that's why I agree with you. I'd wait next week to make that decision, Seth.
Yes, indeed. And then call us first thing so we can talk to you about it.
Absolutely. But Sonny Perdue really likes Seth Meyer. That was made clear to me by a number of sources this week.
All right. So stay tuned for more news on that. Let's see. What else do we have on the list for today? Back to the election. I meant to hit this earlier. You had we talked a little bit in the intro before we started recording. You did a fantastic piece this week, really breaking down potential wins and losses, no matter which way this election goes. And I think it's important to highlight that there are wins for agriculture, no matter if Trump wins or if Biden wins. So let's hit on some of those first.
Well, you've got, as I said before, the overall ideology of the two political parties are different when it comes to agriculture. The usual Republican administration, usual, is more market oriented, where the Democrats tend to focus on the smaller and medium sized producers. There's no value. I mean, I put no right or wrong on that, but that's just a different approach. We've already discussed the energy related aspects where the parties will have different major difference of opinions relative to how they will implement any climate change provisions. And I think that really plays into, I think, the next revenue stream for agriculture that I actually see bipartisan support for, because eliminating CO2 emissions, on the one hand, could result in regulations costly for producers to meet, driving up cost in a very energy intensive sector. But there's the other side is the revenue generating side, is that for carbon credits and other things that agriculture can contribute to get a revenue stream going. So there's balances there, John. I'm trying to think some other things that I mentioned. Trade policy. I think Biden would be very cautious his first year or so on trade policy, would be very similar to Trump, with the exception of he would be far more positive relative to the World Trade Organization, in wanting to get back into its good graces and to challenge some countries' aspects. I think that I know that he eventually wants to get back into the Trans-Pacific Partnership, now called the CPTPP. But this is going to take some time.
There ought to be a limit on the number of letters in those titles.
Yeah,
too long.
I know. So, but they're very similar regarding China. It's the only one exception where I think Biden would consistently says he wants to consult more with allies, where Trump said both Republican and Democrat administration in the past tried that and it failed. So I don't see him changing. USMCA would definitely be an item where you would have any Democrat run White House and Congress really focus on Mexico's following through with their labor and environmental language. We talked on AgriTalk about the differences in approaches to tax policy, where Trump would want to at least propose further tax cuts and zeroing in on the middle class sector this time. If Biden were to win, and Congress is Democrat in tone, you would see an increase in corporate taxes, capital gains taxes that would impact more than a few farmers, and possible changes in estate taxes relative to lower exemptions and the basis, more along the lines of capital gains taxes. So yeah, we've seen that farm policy. It depends on who's the Senate and House Ag Committee chairman, because they really write the farm bill. Even Trump wouldn't want to write a farm bill, trust me. So who's going to lead the Senate Ag Committee? Will it be John Boozman from Arkansas, who would take over from Pat Roberts because he's retiring? If the Republicans keep control of the Senate, or if not, then it's back to Debbie Stabenow, a Democrat from Michigan, and she's a known commodity. But what a difference! Stabenow is known for changing farm policy relative to more urban agriculture, specialty crops, etc. She's not nearly as Southern oriented in her focus. That's an understatement there.
Yeah.
So and Boozman says he wants to start the debate of the farm bill next year, but he doesn't want to rewrite it next year because it just takes time.
You just made kind of an esoteric question pop into my mind, Jim, and I know you'll know the answer. What if there is a 50-50 Senate split? Does the vice president's vote make a difference in setting committee assignments?
They will have to. I know. I usually in the past they go on the ratio. I think that they go back and forth on history of who gets the ratio. If that's what you're asking, who gets the
Well, no, I'm
majority
asking
on
about
the
chairman.
committees?
Yeah, majority on the committees.
Oh
If
no,
it's a
the
50-50
chairmanships
split,
are done by the parties. By the parties.
well,
Uh,
yeah, but if it's a 50-50 split, do the Democrats then set the chairmanships because of the vice president, or what's the mechanism there?
they would get it because of the it would have to be approved on the floors, and so yeah, they if it's 50-50 and Biden wins the White House, then the Democrats would have
Democrats would
majority
win.
control on the
Okay.
committees. I thought you were going on the ratios because that can change.
Yeah, I know.
But as far as chairmanship, of course, I didn't mention House Ag Committee. Is Peterson going to win or lose his race
Right.
with Michelle Bachmann in the 7th Congressional District? That's a major change because who's going to replace Peterson as far as chairman? Because of his institutional memory, and depending on who it is, you could have a very philosophical change on that House Ag Committee on what topics are going to be addressed.
Yeah, indeed. All right. We mentioned at the top. Well, before we move away from that, I want to mention you very generously before we started said that you're going to make that analysis available to Signal to Noise viewers and listeners. So if you're interested in getting that breakdown that Jim did on the two campaigns, drop us an email at signaltonoise@farmjournal.com, and we'll email that back out to you. Again, that's signaltonoise@farmjournal.com. Same address if you want to drop us a question or comment through the week. Would be very interested in hearing from you all on election night at signaltonoise@farmjournal.com, and send us your observations through the night. Jim and I are going to be sharing our observations through election night, along with Chip Flory, Sean Haney, Clinton Griffiths. Watch on agweb.com. We'll be sending short comments throughout the night on our own personal analysis as we watch the election results that night. And then come 9 p.m. Central, 10 p.m. Eastern, Jim, you and I are going to hop back in front of our cameras and do a special DC Signal to Noise that night. And who knows what we'll know at 10 o'clock.
With the information as best as we have. And you listeners and viewers, you can be our grassroots. You're the local people. Text us or whatever, what you're hearing on your districts and your state, races, because believe it or not, you may know something that most people don't. So, definitely we will share some information because I always love grassroots input.
Yeah, and Anita, not just on the national races, but we definitely want to hear your perspective on some of those local races, the ones we talked about before, Joni Ernst, the Iowa Senate seat, the Kansas Senate seat, Colin Peterson seat in Minnesota. Plus, if there are any local referenda that are of interest to agriculture that we may not be tracking, let us know. We'd like to hear about them, so that we know and can share. Because especially, we talk a lot about California, but those California referenda, because California is so big, they end up impacting the rest of the country just because in order to serve California, you have to comply with their propositions.
And John, I ended the special report on the U.S. and world economy where I think I should have. And that's going to be predicated on how the COVID-19 situation is dealt with. When will the pharmaceuticals be out? Vaccines, when and how quickly, things like that, because that's going to impact not only the U.S. economy, but the world. And in an era now where farm exports are so important, and sometimes the difference between profit and loss in agriculture, how that transpires is critical for the macro side of the ag industry. And from a presidential administration perspective, how will each president continue to deal with COVID-19? Will Biden put more restrictions in place to battle the COVID pandemic? We've seen some of the negative implications of that earlier this year, especially how that impacted the restaurants, schools, and how that parlayed into negatives for the dairy industry, specialty crops industry, fruits and vegetables, etc. So this is where policy just meshes very significantly to administration decisions.
All right, Pat checking in saying Texas is not going to turn blue. Pat, we both agree with you, but I will add, Jim, Texas Republicans are going to get a scare election night. They are going to be scared about their future at the end of this election night.
If they do, because I will tell you, in a number of states, the Republicans acted like Democrats in getting more new registrations out. I think that they did a far better job on what we called retail campaigning, door to door. Now, the Democrats didn't do as much of that because they were worried about more COVID, related issues. I want to see the numbers first to see whether or not it's a clear signal that Texas is turning purple. I want to see if more Texans said enough of this already. I'm going to vote where I didn't vote in 2016. And so I'm going to let the numbers speak for themselves.
Yeah, well, I'm going to go a little further and say that no, it's not going to turn blue, but there are going to be issues in those numbers. It may not be the top line red versus blue number, but there will be some things in those numbers that are going to raise the hair on the back of Republicans' necks in Texas.
Fair enough.
Because that's the direction that state has been heading for a while. It was very deeply red, and it is no longer very deeply red. And I think that momentum is continuing. Whether it will continue at the same pace into 2024, I think how both parties respond to election night next Tuesday will determine that.
Well, I'm going to see demographics again. I think is going to be critical. I want to see if those Hispanics coming into this country legally from countries like El Salvador, Venezuela, etc., who literally ran away from a certain form of government, would they be more amenable to some signals in a party that tends to want to have, for whatever lack of better word, economic socialism? Or would they rather more vote for a party that's more market oriented and less, dictatorial when it comes to the market place? That's a fair question to ask, and I'm going to see if we're going to see changes in Hispanic voting in particular states. Not all states, but in particular states, to where they're very heavy recent years in the in the number of immigrants. And Florida would be one. Arizona, I think, will be key. And on the Black American vote, we've said this before on the program. One of the reasons Hillary Clinton lost is because she didn't have near the numbers of young Black American voters 40 years or younger. Will having Kamala Harris on the ticket help Biden? Now, Biden, the Black American voter, helped him get the Democratic Party nomination. Will that continue to flow, or will initial signals that more than a few young Black American men are saying they're going to vote for Trump? 8% of Black Americans voted for Trump in 2016. Will that percentage go to 11, 13%? If that's the case, Georgia is going to go Republican. Interesting.
All right, let's wrap up talking about Commodity Classic. They made the announcement today. Here's We Talk on Friday about, well, actually, let's respond to this comment coming in from Tom before we move on to something else. Tom saying farmers collect more socialism than any group in this country. Slapping tariffs on everybody is not market oriented.
It's a counterpoint. I'll just say that. Yeah. But agriculture is a strategic industry, and they were more than impacted by the decision to take on China, which, by the way, Biden agrees with. Maybe not the way Trump did it, but the tactics that China outright thieved intellectual property, not only from U.S. but around the world. But I think that's a legitimate counterpoint as far as all the money. But I wouldn't call it socialism. That's income transfer that is needed because of it would have been catastrophic. If you wanted a depression in agriculture, look where the around $50 billion would have done if that wouldn't have been transported through the agriculture sector as a result of trade mitigation payments and the two CFAP payment programs, which, by the way, had bipartisan support in Congress. I'm not saying the Democrats totally agreed with everything, and I think that's why they'll put some stipulations on it in the future, especially if they get into a power.
Yeah, and Tom notes that he's a large farmer, so probably did see was a recipient of some of that. And again, there is a strategic reason for it, but you're right that what Tom is saying is not baseless. And I think it's going to be it's going to be a challenge for agriculture as we go into negotiation of a new farm bill. If that that sentiment exists and persists into that discussion, Trump lavished, I'm not saying this is what I believe, but I'm saying the argument is that, Trump lavished $28 billion on farmers. Do we really want to do that again?
Well, look at this from a policy perspective. This around $50 billion, and it's probably going to be more when all is said and done. Yeah. That's not in a budget baseline for a farm bill. And see, this is a conundrum here. What do you do?
What is
we have seen an appreciation of prices. I hope it continues because you've got corn and soybeans having $1 to $1.50 price rallies here, as well as other commodities. So maybe the market is turning around. Let's hope that's the case, where these income transfer payments are not needed nearly as much as they were in the past. I hope that's the case.
Indeed. All right, let's wrap it up with a discussion about Commodity Classic, which, as we said here on Friday, announced that they were going to go virtual this year. For those that aren't familiar, I think most of our listeners are going to be. It's the joint annual meeting between the National Corn Growers, American Soybean Association, National Sorghum Producers, and National Association of Wheat Growers. Also, recently, Association of Equipment Manufacturers have gotten in on it as well. They usually all get together in one place. This year was supposed to be San Antonio, Texas, the first week of March. Now it's going to be all virtual the first week of March. And my question to you, Jim, is this is usually a place where a lot of agriculture gets face-to-face with ag leaders in the administration. Is this a big missed opportunity for agriculture not having that face-to-face in 2021, which could be a transition year?
Yeah, I think it will be another transition year. This is kind of a lost year as far as I'm concerned. But I went out last week for my first, I drove to the Greenbrier for a crop insurance agents meeting, and there were about 200 there. They took great pains for protection, but I couldn't believe how much I missed traveling and that connection, outside talks and things like that. So on that basis, John, I think that it is a nick. I would think behind the scenes why the Commodity Classic did what they did is insurance reasons, corporate reasons, because corporations are not having more than a few of their people travel at all. So they probably hit that. Plus the attendance. What would have been the attendance? It's going to be interesting whether or not USDA's Ag Outlook conference goes virtual next year. I don't think they indicated initial information about the conference, but I don't think they said for sure whether or not it was going to be virtual. But we're still in the.
No, they did say it's virtual. Yeah,
they did say.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then that's just. Then they probably did the same thing. Insurance purposes.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were talking about Commodity Classic.
No, Commodity Classic. I knew. I don't think USDA has said virtual yet.
No,
but they wanted to put out the dates first. But with the virtual, with the avalanche of webinars that we've seen, or virtual, or whatever you want to call it, you can stay in contact that way. But it's still not like the networking that you and I and others and farmers and agribusiness people do with farmers and ranchers at trade shows and things. I think Commodity Classic is primarily a trade show myself.
Right.
But I think that will be missed. There's no doubt about it.
Well, it's not like, in previous years when, say, the president of the National Corn Growers gets to pull aside the incoming new USDA secretary, you just have a few moments directly to talk about priorities and really just kind of setting the stage for what will be a developing relationship, or any of the commodity groups and any of the agency directors that make that trip to Commodity Classic, which several agency directors and staffers have in past years, and I think that's going to be missed.
Yeah, I
Your
think
point about
what the new secretary will do, it's ag secretary, you'll have those confidential webinars with the board of directors at the commodity groups and things like that. That can still occur. So I think the grapevine will still be there, just a different format.
Yep. And to your point about what's driving these changes and going virtual with these events, from experience I've had, farmers are willing and actually in many cases anxious to go to some of these events. The reasons that for the most part that they are getting canceled or switched to virtual is, one, that exhibitors can't go. You mentioned the companies have very tight restrictions on their employees. For the health and safety of their employees, and also because of liability. They are not letting their employees travel, so they can't get the sponsors at these trade events. And the other is restrictions at the event locations themselves being put on by municipalities or states, either severely limiting what can be done at those venues or not allowing anything at all at those venues. Those, from what I've seen, are the two driving factors in those cancellations.
I agree. At Greenbrier, they had, of course, the top security anyway there, but you had to go through security to get in. If you were not wearing your mask, they were right on you at that. That's a big facility there. Their meetings, even though some were inside, were huge halls that fit a fraction of the people that you had in the meeting. So it was fairly impressive. And then they had better ventilation going through. And the receptions that I attended were all outside. And I think that helped as well. So there are things you can do, relative to having some meetings, but I think it's the corporations, and that's their prerogative. I've seen it at the university levels, to where land grant universities, in many cases, will not let their economists travel, and if they do, it's only one and not several to any meetings. I've seen that as well.
All right, Jim, I think I can take a guess where you're watching for signal in the next week.
I'm going to be spending most of the weekend continuing to do research and coming up with tables, if you will, plots, matrices for election night, John. And we may put them out earlier and for viewers and listeners to see. And if we forgot something, definitely text us on that. So we're going to have a template, if you will, to try to make analysis of this election a little less complex on election night, going through the key House ag races, Senate races that will determine the control of the Senate, and of course those key counties that we're going to watch in Florida and Pennsylvania, etc. And then we'll pick up the 5 pollsters that are mostly quoted and to see how accurate they are when the fat lady sings on this one.
All right, Aaron, check it in. I think some corporations also facing profit revenue loss, which is why their employees are traveling less, not just safety and liability. Good point. There
that is very good point. Absolutely. Good point.
All right, one last quick run through some of the reminders here. Again, if you want that election analysis from Jim, email us at signaltonoise@farmjournal.com. Same email if you want to drop us a comment or question. We'd love to hear from you on that. If you want, Jim, you mentioned some of that tax analysis from Paul Neiffer. As soon as we get done here recording, I'm hoping I've got the edit back on the piece from his appearance on AgriTalk talking about that. So watch agweb.com for that. And then election night, agweb.com for some quick analysis throughout the evening from me, Jim Wiesmeyer, Clinton Griffiths, Chip Flory, Sean Haney, and maybe some others as well. And then 10 o'clock Eastern, 9 p.m. Central, come back either here to the AgriTalk Facebook page or to agweb.com, and we'll have some live analysis on whatever we know at that point. In the meantime, Jim, thanks so much for the analysis today, and we'll talk to you on Tuesday night.
Here we go.
Here we go. Thanks for joining us this week on DC Signal to Noise.